"You have 10 days to take those panels down," the woman in the cream blazer said, as if the roof already belonged to her. The morning sun had just cleared the maples around Alderwick Crest Court, laying hard white reflections across 38 nearly identical homes arranged around the broad cul-de-sac. Sprinklers hissed over trimmed lawns, tires whispered across warm asphalt, and the air carried the mingled smells of wet grass, hot roofing shingles, and chlorine drifting from the small HOA pool behind the clubhouse. Russell Kessler did not move. He stood beside his mailbox in a faded blue work shirt, one hand resting loosely on the wooden post, his silver hair still damp from an early shower. At 63, he had the settled posture of a man who had spent years listening to complicated explanations and waiting for the one sentence that revealed the weakness underneath them. Above him, 24 matte black solar panels sat flush against the south-facing roof, aligned in 2 precise rows and connected through a county-inspected electrical system approved 3 weeks earlier. Everything was permitted. Corinne Sloane clicked a metal pen against the leather-covered clipboard pressed to her chest. Her ash-blonde hair had been sprayed into place. Her narrow heels sank slightly into the seam between the curb and the asphalt, and an oversized HOA badge hung from a gold chain as though it carried authority beyond the neighborhood entrance sign. She tilted her chin toward the roof and described the panels as a visible disruption to community roofline continuity. Russell watched her finish. "Which written standard are you citing?" he asked. Corinne's smile tightened without disappearing. She explained that the board retained broad interpretive authority whenever an exterior alteration threatened property values, neighborhood cohesion, or what she called the established visual rhythm of the court. She added that formal language did not need to name every possible device in order for the HOA to act. That was her kingdom. A white golf cart rolled slowly past the corner, its small electric motor whining beneath the dry rustle of oak leaves. 2 members of the architectural committee sat inside, both wearing polo shirts stitched with the Alderwick crest, and one of them raised a phone to photograph Russell's roof from the street. Corinne glanced at them, then back at Russell, reassured by the performance of witnesses. He gave her nothing. She stepped onto his walkway without invitation and pointed to the black metal frames, claiming their finish created excessive glare and an uneven energy profile that could affect the community's shared infrastructure. Russell looked toward the clubhouse, where 3 decorative lanterns still burned in full daylight above the locked pool gate. Then he looked at her clipboard. "Does the HOA own my electric meter?" Corinne paused for less than a second. She recovered by saying the association managed the collective interests of every household and would not allow one homeowner's private choices to undermine a neighborhood standard. Her voice remained polished, but the clicking pen had stopped. Russell noticed. Corinne removed a red card from her folder and hung it from the brass handle of his front door. The card listed a mandatory roofline compliance inspection of $71.46, a preliminary documentation charge of $33.17, and a possible $463.28 assessment if the panels remained after the 10-day deadline. At the bottom, in bold capital letters, were the words "Notice of Immediate Removal." Russell read every line. Corinne waited for anger, protest, or bargaining, but he simply lifted the card from the handle, folded it once along the existing crease, and carried it inside. Behind him, the inverter relay clicked softly, its status light turned green, and sunlight began feeding power into the house. The system stayed on. Inside the house, Russell laid the red notice flat on the walnut table and switched off the kitchen radio. The room settled into a deep, late-morning quiet, broken only by the soft pulse of the refrigerator and the faint electrical hum from the inverter mounted in the garage. Through the open window came the smell of sun-warmed pine mulch, wet concrete from a neighbor's sprinkler, and a sharp chemical trace of pool chlorine drifting across the cul-de-sac. He read twice. The notice cited Section 8.14, Roofline Grid Uniformity, followed by 3 paragraphs about reflective surfaces, neighborhood symmetry, and shared energy stability. Russell opened the thick binder of HOA declarations he had received when he bought the house 11 years earlier, ran one finger down the index, and turned slowly through every architectural amendment. Section 8 ended at 8.09. There was no 8.14. By 4 o'clock, a cold email arrived through the HOA portal with the subject line, Mandatory Exterior Compliance Action. It repeated the 10-day deadline, added a warning that refusal to permit an inspection could be treated as separate noncompliance, and instructed him to upload a removal contract from a licensed roofing company within 72 hours. The message was signed electronically by Corinne Sloane, president, followed by 6 lines of committee titles. Russell saved the file. The next morning, footsteps crunched across the decorative gravel beside his driveway while he was making coffee. Corinne stood near the side gate with Harriet Vance and a younger architectural committee member, all three facing the roof and speaking in low, administrative tones. Harriet carried a tablet. The younger man held a measuring wheel, and Corinne wore a rose-colored blazer despite the heat already rising from the blacktop. They looked official. Russell stepped onto the porch and asked whether they had scheduled access to his property. Corinne said the committee was conducting a non-invasive visual assessment from common access areas and pointed toward the narrow strip of grass between his driveway and the sidewalk. Russell noted that the strip belonged to his parcel, not the association, and asked them to return to the public walkway. Harriet lowered her eyes to the tablet. Corinne did not. She announced that obstructing an authorized review could trigger a $58.62 access delay assessment, then instructed the younger man to photograph the rear roof line through the opening beside the gate. Russell closed the gate without force and remained beside it. "Send the authority in writing," he said. Corinne's mouth flattened. By noon, a certified letter was waiting at the post office. It claimed the solar array produced unapproved visual fragmentation, potential glare migration, and a measurable deviation from the court's established roof profile, though no measurement was included. A second page warned that unpaid assessments could be referred for civil collection and possibly attached to the property account. At the bottom, the board demanded written consent for a roof inspection within 5 business days. Russell placed the letter beside the red card and printed the original architectural rules from the county recording system. The newest recorded amendment was 4 years old and concerned satellite dishes, exterior antennas, and rooftop ventilation equipment. It said nothing about solar panels. Nothing at all. That evening, Corinne spoke at the clubhouse before 12 folding chairs and a dry erase board marked Community Standards Review. The pool pump throbbed behind the wall. Ceiling vents pushed out air that smelled faintly of dust and disinfectant, and the decorative lights flickered above a framed photograph of the original development. Corinne described Russell's system without using his name, calling it a unilateral alteration that could lower surrounding property values and disrupt shared infrastructure planning. Several neighbors shifted uncomfortably. Russell sat in the back row, listening. When the floor opened for questions, he raised one hand and asked when Section 8.14 had been adopted, who had voted for it, and where the recorded amendment could be found. Corinne replied that interpretive standards did not require the same process as covenant amendments when the board was protecting the community from an emerging technology. Russell nodded once. Then he wrote down her exact words. The next morning, Russell installed no new equipment and made no dramatic calls. He simply checked the 2 exterior cameras already mounted beneath his eaves, confirmed that each lens covered only his porch, driveway, side gate, and roof line, then synchronized the timestamp with an official network time server. A delivery truck groaned somewhere beyond the entrance monument. Dry leaves scraped along the curb, and the first sprinkler cycle sent thin streams ticking against a neighbor's aluminum fence. He began quietly. At 8:15, Russell placed the red card, the certified letter, and a printed copy of Corinne's portal email into separate clear sleeves. He labeled each sleeve by date, delivery method, claimed authority, and amount demanded, using the same restrained handwriting he had once used on utility rate investigations worth millions of dollars. Then he opened a fresh spreadsheet and entered every sentence that linked the solar panels to shared costs, community infrastructure, or energy stability. Words left patterns. Russell had spent 32 years finding them. Before retiring, He had served as a forensic auditor for disputed electric rate programs, where municipalities, commercial associations, and energy suppliers often buried financial incentives beneath harmless-sounding administrative language. He knew how rebates were renamed, how private meters were quietly grouped into larger calculations, and how a single appendix could contradict 20 pages of confident promises. No one at Alderwick Crest Court knew that. Corinne believed he repaired radios. At 10 o'clock, Russell drove to the county records office in an older gray pickup that carried no bumper stickers and drew no attention. The building smelled of paper dust, floor wax, and stale coffee, while fluorescent lights buzzed above rows of public terminals. He downloaded the recorded subdivision declaration, every amendment filed since the development opened, the parcel map for his lot, and the easement schedule covering utility access. The parcel records confirmed that the roof belonged to his lot, while the utility service certificate confirmed that the meter was held under his individual account. Nothing granted the HOA authority over private electrical generation, and no recorded amendment mentioned community load coherence, roofline grid uniformity, or any comparable phrase. The language had appeared from nowhere. Russell printed the documents, paid $18.64 in reproduction and certification fees, and kept the receipt because dates mattered almost as much as words. Back home, the afternoon heat had softened the tar along the street seams, filling the air with the bitter smell of hot asphalt. An HOA golf cart moved slowly past his house, its tires whispering over the pavement while the driver glanced toward the panels and continued without stopping. Russell's camera recorded the pass. He saved that too. At 4:23, he submitted a formal records request through the association portal. It asked for the board resolution adopting Section 8.14, all meeting minutes discussing solar installations, all contracts involving electricity or utility credits, all invoices connected to shared energy planning, and every policy authorizing inspection of privately owned rooftops. The request was narrow, numbered, and written without accusation. That made it harder to dismiss. Corinne replied 17 minutes later. Her message stated that architectural interpretations were internal governance materials and that vendor agreements were confidential business documents unrelated to his violation. Russell read the sentence twice, then leaned back in his chair as the ceiling fan turned above him with a soft mechanical click. She had confirmed a vendor agreement existed. That evening, while the cul-de-sac darkened and porch lights came on one by one, Russell opened the Utility Commission's public archive of feeder-level load reports and retail energy program filings. Crickets chirped in the drainage swale. The pool gate clanged shut in. The distance and cool air carrying the faint scent of damp soil moved through his office window. He found a broader decline in grid purchases across the service area, then compared that trend with the HOA's meeting dates and budget entries rather than relying on private household data. Then he found another entry. The clubhouse budget had added a line called Community Facilities Conservation Credit in the same quarter. Russell highlighted both dates and placed them side by side. He did not contact Corinne. He wanted more. Corinne's next notice arrived before sunrise on the 7th day. The envelope was wedged beneath Russell's windshield wiper, damp with dew, and stamped with a red diagonal stripe, reading Escalated Compliance Status. A lawn service rumbled 2 houses away. Sprinklers hissed across the median, and the cool air smelled of wet bark, gasoline, and fresh-cut grass. The pressure had begun. Inside, the board assessed $463.28 for a distributed roofline deviation, $71.46 for a panel reflection field review, and $33.17 for community load stability documentation. A separate sheet announced that a continued generation nonconformity charge of $42.83 would accrue every calendar day after the original deadline. The amounts were precise enough to appear calculated, but no formula, inspection report, or supporting invoice was attached. Russell photographed the envelope where it had been placed. Then he logged the time. At 9:12, he sent Corinne 3 questions through the HOA portal, which recorded covenant authorized regulation of electricity generated behind a private meter, which board vote created the daily charge, in which licensed professional had performed a reflection review. He did not accuse her of misconduct. He asked for records. Corinne answered that afternoon with a polished paragraph warning him not to confuse procedural details with the board's broad duty to protect the community. She said further delay would be interpreted as deliberate defiance and could result in referral to the association's civil collection vendor. Her signature block now included the phrase Executive Compliance Authority. Russell saved the message. 2 days later, every resident received a community-wide email titled Protecting Shared Infrastructure Costs. It never named Russell, yet warned that individual energy decisions could transfer expenses to responsible homeowners and threaten neighborhood services. The clubhouse lanterns glowed in full daylight again. The pool pump droned behind the fence, and a faint smell of overheated plastic hung near the utility cabinet beside the parking lot. The contradiction was almost elegant. At the next association session, Corinne stood before a projected chart with no source labels and claimed that rooftop generation created unpredictable demand patterns for gates, irrigation controls, and community lighting. She wore a burgundy blazer, silver heels, and the same oversized badge, while Harriet Vance sat beside her with both hands folded over a stack of budget sheets. Several residents glanced toward Russell when Corinne said one homeowner had refused to cooperate despite multiple professional assessments. Russell remained in the last row. He waited. When questions opened, he asked whether the HOA's shared facilities were billed through the private meters attached to individual houses. Corinne replied that modern utility planning was more complicated than one meter or one invoice and said the board had access to commercial information residents might not understand. Harriet looked down. Russell noticed that too. The following morning, another certified letter arrived, this one threatening to place the growing balance into civil collection if payment was not made within 15 days. The stated total was $1,361.36. The original $567.91 assessment, 15 days of charges at $42.83 per day, a $96.74 account escalation preparation fee, and $54.26 for administrative energy review. Russell entered each amount into a spreadsheet and compared the dates with the clubhouse budget. The pattern sharpened. 3 weeks earlier, a meeting minute had recorded concern about preserving an aggregate consumption threshold. 4 days later, the new roof standard appeared. 6 days after that, Corinne began issuing penalties. Russell printed the timeline on a single sheet. Then he placed it beneath the line item labeled Community Facilities Conservation Credit. The dates touched. That night, an HOA golf cart rolled slowly past his home twice, its electric motor whining through the darkness, while dry leaves clicked along the gutter. Russell's camera recorded the cart, the time, and the clipboard resting on the passenger seat. He watched the footage once, archived it, and turned back to the contract request Corinne still refused to answer. Her confidence was producing evidence faster than he could organize it. Russell let her continue. The full contract arrived 3 days later in a padded envelope that smelled faintly of copier toner and old storage boxes. Corinne had included a cover letter stating that the board was providing the material as a professional courtesy and reserved the right to charge Russell $84.39 for extraordinary document preparation. Outside, a summer storm pressed low over Alderwick Crest Court. Gutters rattled beneath sudden rain, and wet leaves slapped softly against the driveway. The envelope was incomplete. Russell spread the pages across his dining table and checked the numbering before reading a single clause. The agreement jumped from Appendix B to Appendix E, while the table of contents listed a consumption credit schedule, a resident participation addendum, and a meter classification exhibit that were nowhere in the package. Someone had removed the useful parts. At 7:40 the next morning, Russell sent a supplemental records demand identifying each missing appendix by title and page count. He attached the association's own index and requested the original electronic file, the board resolution authorizing execution, the recorded vote, and every invoice showing how the credit had been calculated. He copied Harriet Vance in her official capacity as treasurer. Corinne replied that the omitted sections contained proprietary pricing information and could not be distributed to homeowners. Russell answered with one sentence. Please identify the governing provision that overrides a member's right to inspect association financial records. By afternoon, Harriet called from a block number. Her voice was careful, almost whispered, and the background carried the hollow echo of the clubhouse office along with the steady thump of the pool pump through the wall. She said she could not discuss board matters privately, but suggested Russell compare the annual budget adopted in March with the treasurer's draft circulated in February. Then she ended the call. That was enough. Russell searched old portal attachments and found both versions buried beneath meeting notices and landscaping invoices. The February draft identified a projected payment of $18,750 as aggregate residential consumption incentive. The March budget renamed the same amount Community Facilities Conservation Credit. Same number, different disguise. The missing appendices appeared the following evening after the association's management company reviewed Russell's request. The electronic file was 112 pages long and included an execution page showing that Corinne and one other board member had signed it 11 months earlier. Russell printed only the critical sections, while rainwater ticked from the eaves and the kitchen filled with the clean metallic smell of the storm. He read in silence. The credit schedule promised the HOA an annual payment if total grid purchases attributed to participating accounts remained above a specified threshold. The resident addendum required written, voluntary enrollment from every private account holder. The meter exhibit listed only the clubhouse, entry lighting, irrigation controls, and pool equipment as association-owned accounts. No residential meter belonged there. The decisive language appeared near the back. The association could not restrict private generation, penalize reduced consumption, or condition architectural approval on continued participation in the supplier's program. Violation permitted suspension of credits and recovery of improper payments. Corinne had signed beneath it. Russell created a timeline with 5 columns. Contract execution, consumption decline, supplier warning, creation of Section 8.14, and first solar penalty. The dates formed a clean sequence. When grid purchases fell near the threshold, the supplier warned the HOA that its credit might be reduced. 4 days later, Corinne called an executive session. 6 days after that, the new roof rule appeared. Then the notices began. At 10:17 that night, the management company released one additional responsive email after Harriet identified it in the board archive. Marked board confidential. It instructed the treasurer to preserve the credit by discouraging distributed generation before adoption becomes widespread, and assured the board that residents would not understand the commercial structure. Russell printed the message and placed it on top of the contract. The trap was complete. The special meeting was scheduled for Thursday at 7, and Corinne announced it through the HOA portal as a final compliance hearing. She reserved the clubhouse, arranged rows of folding chairs, and uploaded a 12-slide presentation titled Protecting Alderwick Crest Property Values. By noon, the parking lot smelled of hot pavement and pool chlorine, while maintenance crews dragged extension cords through the side door and tested the projector as a presentation remote clicked with every slide change. Corinne won an audience. Russell spent the morning reducing his evidence rather than adding to it. He placed the contract, the missing appendices, the utility service certificate, the February budget draft, Corinne's confidential email, and the 5-column timeline in a separate folders marked with plain numbered tabs. Then he prepared a single page showing the sequence from supplier warning to solar penalties, with no adjectives and no accusation. Facts needed no decoration. At 2:30, Russell spoke by phone with a civil attorney named Elena Marsh, who had spent the previous 2 days reviewing the contract language and the association's recorded authority. She confirmed that the HOA could manage electricity purchased for common property, but nothing in the declaration allowed it to pledge private residential usage or punish owners for reducing demand behind individually controlled meters. She also noted that the voluntary participation clause made Corinne's architectural campaign particularly difficult to defend. Russell printed her written opinion. He did not send it to Corinne. After Elena sent a formal notice to the supplier and copied the HOA's management company, Malcolm Price, the supplier's account manager, agreed to attend and confirmed in cautious corporate language that the company had issued no directive against private solar systems. That was enough. By late afternoon, Alderwick Crest Court had taken on the restless quiet that came before neighborhood conflict. Garage doors rose and fell, dry leaves scraped across driveways, and conversations stopped whenever Corinne's white golf cart moved past with a stack of presentation boards strapped to the rear seat. She wore a deep red blazer and pointed silver heels, despite the uneven brick path leading into the clubhouse. The costume was deliberate. Harriet arrived, separately carrying a gray file box against her chest. She avoided Corinne near the entrance, then handed Russell a copy of the original budget worksheet, showing the energy credit before its name had been changed. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice did not. She said the board would never need to explain it, Harriet whispered. Russell placed the worksheet in folder 4. Inside, the clubhouse air conditioner rattled against the summer humidity, pushing out air that smelled of dust, carpet cleaner, and the sweet artificial fragrance used in the restrooms. Current slides were already projected on the wall, showing roof lines, resale statistics, and a diagram labeled Community Energy Balance with no source listed beneath it. 31 residents filled the chairs, more than had attended any budget meeting in years. Corinne mistook curiosity for support. Russell sat in the second row with only 6 slim folders on his lap. Malcolm took a chair near the aisle, wearing a navy suit and the guarded expression of a man who had been sent to protect a contract from the people using it. Harriet sat at the board table, but left an empty space between herself and Corinne. The remaining directors spoke in low voices, glancing repeatedly at the supplier representative. Corinne tapped the microphone twice, smiled toward the crowd, and declared that the board had shown extraordinary patience with a homeowner who refused to respect collective responsibility. She announced that Russell's outstanding balance had reached $3,288.71 after 60 daily charges and 2 administrative fees, and said the hearing would determine whether the account should proceed to civil collection. Russell looked at the projector, then at the folder containing Corinne's own signature. He waited for her to finish. Corinne finished with a slide showing Russell's house beneath a red banner labeled Non-Compliant Energy Installation. The projector fanned word against the strained silence. Chair legs scraped softly across the clubhouse floor, and outside the pool filtration system pulsed like a distant engine behind the wall. She turned toward Russell with the calm satisfaction of someone expecting surrender. "Do you dispute the balance?" she asked. Russell stood without hurry. He carried the 6 folders to the small lectern, placed them beneath the projector light, and asked Corinne whether the HOA owned the electric meter attached to his house. A few residents leaned forward, while Malcolm Price opened his copy of the contract and Harriet pressed both palms against the table. Corinne smiled. She said the board's authority extended beyond the physical ownership of individual equipment whenever private conduct affected collective costs. Under the hearing procedure, Walter gave Russell control of the projector for his allotted response. Russell clicked to the first page he had prepared. It displayed the county parcel record, the utility service certificate, and the association's own meter exhibit, all enlarged enough for the back row to read. The only HOA-controlled accounts were the clubhouse, pool, entry lights, and irrigation system. His meter was not among them. Corinne shifted to architectural authority. Russell displayed the recorded covenants and the amendment log, showing that Section 8.14 had never been recorded, circulated, or approved by a valid board vote. The rule had appeared 6 days after the supplier warned that the neighborhood's electricity purchases were approaching the minimum threshold for its annual credit. The room changed. Corinne said the timing was coincidental and attempted to move the discussion back to glare, roofline harmony, and property values. Russell opened folder 3 and projected the contract's voluntary participation clause, followed by the provision forbidding the association from penalizing private generation or conditioning architectural approval on continued grid consumption. Her signature appeared directly below both paragraphs. No one spoke. Russell then displayed the budget drafts. In February, the expected $18,750 payment was labeled Aggregate Residential Consumption Incentive. In March, it had become Community Facilities Conservation Credit, even though the amount and accounting code remained identical. Harriet confirmed that Corinne had ordered the description changed before the budget was distributed to residents. Her voice carried clearly. Corinne's hand tightened around her metal pen. Russell moved to the final page, a timeline with 5 dates. The supplier's warning came first, then Corinne's closed session, then the invented roof standard, then the first removal notice, then the daily $42.83 charge. Beneath the timeline sat Corinne's email directing the board to discourage private generation before it became widespread because residents would not understand the commercial arrangement. The words filled the wall. Corinne tried to interrupt. Russell looked toward Malcolm and asked whether the supplier had instructed Alderwick Crest to fine residents, remove solar panels, or preserve electricity purchases through architectural enforcement. Malcolm closed the contract before answering. No, he said. He explained that participation by private account holders had to be voluntary, that the company had never authorized the HOA's penalties, and that interference with lawful private generation could suspend the credit and trigger repayment review. Corinne's expression emptied. One director asked why the board had never received the complete appendices. Another asked why a private utility incentive had been hidden under a clubhouse conservation label. A resident near the aisle held up her own violation notice and demanded to know whether her planned battery system had been delayed for the same reason. The question spread. Russell placed Elena Marsh's written opinion on the table and summarized the consequences in a steady voice. The assessments lacked enforceable authority. The daily charges were unsupported. The contract did not bind private meters, and every resident penalized under the invented standard could seek reimbursement through civil action. Corinne looked toward Malcolm for support, then toward Harriet, then toward the other directors. No one met her eyes. From the back row, a homeowner asked the question Russell had never needed to ask himself. Were you protecting our property values, or protecting that payment? Corinne opened her mouth. Nothing came out. The silence after Corinne failed to answer lasted long enough for the projector to dim automatically. The air conditioner rattled above the ceiling tiles. Someone's folding chair creaked near the rear wall, and the pool gate outside slammed once in the warm night wind. No one looked at Russell. They looked at her. The vice president, a retired accountant named Walter Haynes, moved to suspend Corinne's signing authority and access to association accounts pending independent legal review. 2 directors seconded the motion, and the board approved it by recorded vote while Corinne sat rigid behind the microphone. The management company collected the association credit card and reset the financial credentials before the meeting adjourned. Her authority vanished quietly. Malcolm Price gathered his documents and informed the room that the supplier would suspend the projected $18,750 credit pending a review of enrollment records and any penalties connected to private energy generation. He explained that improperly attributed household consumption could require a recalculation of prior benefits, though the matter would remain contractual and civil. The clubhouse filled with murmurs, paper shuffling, and the dry click of Corinne's pen being set down too hard. The bill had arrived. By the following Monday, acting on council's written advice, the board voted to cancel Russell's $3,288.71 balance and freeze every solar-related enforcement action. The accompanying council memorandum recommended refunding all amounts collected under Section 8.14, preserving the relevant emails, and commissioning an independent audit of the energy agreement. Residents received the notice through the portal at 6:42 a.m., followed by a second message announcing that Corinne no longer possessed signing authority. The wording was clinical. The effect was not. At the mail kiosk that evening, neighbors who had once avoided Russell showed him red cards, certified envelopes, and portal screenshots from their own disputes. One couple had paid $684.52 after proposing a battery backup system, while another homeowner had abandoned a solar application after receiving a $219.63 preliminary grid compatibility review. Russell photographed nothing and promised nothing beyond showing them how to request their records. He did not need followers. He needed a clean ledger. Over the next 7 weeks, the independent audit found that Corinne had presented the energy credit to the board as a discount tied only to common area facilities, even though the supplier's calculation model depended partly on residential purchases. It also found that no homeowner had signed the voluntary enrollment addendum, and that the invented architectural standard had never been adopted through a valid vote. The audit traced the residential figures to a master enrollment spreadsheet Corinne had submitted to the supplier as an association participation roster, even though no individual authorization form supported it. Legal review, accounting work, certified notices, and contract remediation cost the association $27,416.80. The expense was real. At the next PAC meeting, Corinne no longer sat behind the board table. She occupied a folding chair in the first row, wearing a pale gray blazer and low heels, without the oversized badge or leather clipboard that had once announced her before she spoke. The room smelled of burnt coffee, warm copier paper, and fresh floor wax. No one save her place. Eligible homeowners, including properly submitted proxy votes, voted 31-4 to recall Corinne from her director's seat, and the remaining directors then removed her from the office of president and barred her from serving on any financial or architectural committee for the remainder of the term. The board rescinded Section 8.14, approved refunds with interest, and authorized a formal written apology to every affected homeowner. Harriet resigned as treasurer after helping reconcile the accounts, while Walter agreed to serve only until a special election could be held. Corinne remained seated as her nameplate was unscrewed from the wall beside the clubhouse entrance. The metal made a small scraping sound against the painted wood. It was louder than applause. Russell received his apology by certified mail 2 days later, along with confirmation that every assessment, review fee, daily charge, and collection warning had been permanently removed from his account. He filed the letter behind the contract and closed the folder. Outside, the late afternoon sun struck the panels at a low angle. The inverter's cooling fan ran steadily in the garage, and sprinklers whispered across the quiet lawns. Nothing had been removed. The final consequence arrived not through a courtroom spectacle, but through a 23-page civil settlement among the HOA, the supplier, and the affected homeowners, drafted in language Corinne could no longer reinterpret. The supplier's review confirmed that Alderwick Crest had received prior energy credits by counting residential consumption without the written participation forms required by the agreement. Combined with the HOA's minutes, emails, and penalty records, that review established that Corinne's campaign against rooftop generation began only after the company warned that declining grid purchases could eliminate the next $18,750 payment and require recalculation of earlier credits. The secret contract had revealed the real reason. She had not been protecting roof lines, property values, or shared infrastructure. She had been trying to preserve a commercial incentive by forcing residents to keep purchasing more of their electricity from the grid. The settlement voided every solar-related assessment, required the HOA to refund $6,841.37 in collected fees with interest, and prohibited the association from using architectural enforcement to influence any homeowner's choice of energy supplier, generation system, battery storage, or lawful reduction in consumption. The supplier agreed to reduce the HOA's repayment obligation only after the new board terminated the residential component of the program, disclosed all future utility incentives, and submitted 2 years of corrected financial statements. As a condition of the civil settlement and the affected homeowners' release of their individual claims, Corinne signed a written acknowledgement that the board lacked authority over privately owned meters. That signature was the legal blow. Russell received a copy by certified mail on a clear Monday morning. The envelope rested in his mailbox beside a grocery circular and a utility bill showing that his home had drawn almost nothing from the grid during daylight hours. A breeze moved through the maples, dry seed pods clicked against the pavement, and the air carried the mild scent of damp soil after an overnight rain. He opened the settlement at his kitchen table. On page 17, beneath the paragraph confirming that the penalties had been issued to protect the energy credit threshold, Corinne's name appeared in blue ink. Russell read it once. Then he closed the file. The new board adopted a permanent utility transparency rule the following month. Any association contract involving electricity, water, internet service, security systems, or aggregated resident consumption now required full disclosure, an open meeting, and a recorded vote before execution. No incentive could be hidden beneath a general facilities label, and no homeowner could be penalized for refusing to participate in a private commercial arrangement. The rule went further. Every violation notice had to identify the exact governing provision or duly adopted rule, the date it took effect, the evidence supporting the charge, and a meaningful appeal process before any daily fee could begin. Weak rules could no longer hide behind strong letterhead. Russell declined every suggestion that he run for the board. Instead, he created a simple records request template and left copies in the clubhouse beside the meeting agendas. An elderly widow used it to challenge an unexplained landscaping surcharge, and a young couple used it to obtain approval for a battery system Corinne's committee had delayed for months. The process became ordinary. That was the legacy. By autumn, 5 more homes had installed solar panels under the new policy. Their black surfaces caught the afternoon light without damaging a single property value, and the clubhouse reduced its own waste by replacing decorative daytime lighting with timers. Corinne still lived 3 houses from the entrance, but her golf cart no longer made inspection rounds, and no oversized badge rested against her blazer. People greeted her politely. They no longer obeyed her automatically. On a quiet evening, Russell sat beneath the porch light with his late wife's photograph on the table beside him. The inverter gave its familiar soft click from the garage, and the last sunlight faded across the roof that had never belonged to the HOA. He had not defeated Corinne by shouting louder. He had allowed her paperwork to tell the truth. Justice had arrived as corrected ledgers, refunded checks, open records, and a rule strong enough to protect the next person who preferred peace to confrontation. The panels remained. So did the precedent. This story is a fictional narrative created for entertainment, reflection, and educational purposes. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental.